So for the rest of the week, we kind of talked more about decks and things associated with deck construction and design and things like that. So to kind of begin, we learned a little bit more about the different woods that are used for decks. There's hardwood, which is like maple, alder, beech, oak, and then softwoods, which are like fir, cedar, pine, redwood. And these are just different woods used for deck construction. Obviously, some of the woods are more expensive, like redwood. And then usually in a deck design, the cheaper wood, not as expensive and maybe not as pretty wood, is used for like the framing where no one really sees it. And then the higher quality wood is used for the decking so that you see it and it looks nice. Mainly softwood is used for landscape construction, but that just also depends on the client and the budget that they have to use. So there's also with wood, it's you got to make sure you treat it right before you install it. A lot of the times they're pressure treated, which just makes it stronger and more resistant to weather. The boards that are used for construction. On each board, there's usually a stamp of approval because the lumber, when it's cut and then packaged, it gets shipped off to retail. But before that happens, it needs to be approved so that it meets a certain standard, so that it doesn't like break or bend or things like that, so that people aren't selling bad wood. And there's a lot of it is based off of moisture content of the wood, because as we all know, as wood gets wet and then dries and gets wet and dries, it degrades, and it can also bend and distort. So there's 4 different kinds of distortion in wood, depending on the moisture content and how the wood is treated. So the first is cupping, and pretend this is like the plank. I guess I could fold it a little bit. Like this. Pretend this is the board of wood, okay? So cupping is when it bends up like this, and it creates like this kind of cup form on the plank. And this isn't good, because how are you supposed to nail it down and keep it even if it's bowed like this, which isn't good. There's crook, which is I can't do it here, but if it's this way and this side comes up, so it crooks up, which also isn't good because you want the board to be flat. There's twisting. When it dries, it twists dry. And then there's bow, which is where it's this way and it bows up. So it also cups, but not this way, this way. All of these aren't good to have, because you buy the boards to either put in housing or on decks, and they're supposed to be flat, because when they're flat, they're the strongest. And if they're bowed and then you put it in and you put weight on it, it's going to snap. So all of this is dependent on the moisture content of the wood. Some other things we talked about is the different stresses that wood has. There's compression, where the wood is pressed together. There's tension, where it's stretched apart, and then there's lateral, where it's being pushed laterally. And so an example, this can really be seen when you bend a piece of wood, because on top is tension, it's being stretched apart, whereas on bottom, the wood is being pushed together, or there's compression. And so these stresses, they happen, but you don't want them to be too prominent, and you don't want them to overwhelm the board, or it's going to snap. The lateral tension is like if there's a fence and then there's wind and it's pushing against it. That's lateral tension, essentially. And kind of how we distribute the load of stresses on the board in a deck is through ties, screws, nails, clamps, things like that. So Simpson strong ties are used often in the industry. There's a variety of them. Some of them are used to hold the joist to the beam. There's like post caps and post base clamps that are used to hold the wood to the concrete, as well as hold the beam to the post. So there's a number of different things that we can use, and they're all dependent on the size the shape of the wood and where the wood is being screwed into. So there's also screws and lags within a deck. A screw is just used to screw in something into a board, and then a lag is used often in like when putting a ledger board onto a building. And a ledger board is just part of the deck that goes onto the building. It doesn't have a post or a footing or anything like that. The building acts as a footing and a post. So we use that to get into the building and really hold it in tight. There's also bolts used in decking that's used to, attach joists together, or beam and joist together. It goes all the way through, and then there's a nut at the end that screws it together really tight. And those are used in decking as well. And another important thing to understand when working with lumber is that there's two sizes of the lumber. There's nominal size, and then there's actual size. And so nominal size is when the board is cut from the tree. That's the size of it. And mostly we speak in nominal sizes, so 2x4, 2x6, 8x10, 2x12, things like that. They're all even numbers. That's because they're cut evenly. But the actual size of the board is after it shrinks. It dries, it's pressure treated, and then it shrinks a little bit. So there's a chart out there that kind of shows the nominal versus actual size of lumber. But usually it's like 1/4 to 1/2 inch that it shrinks down. I mean, it depends on the size of the board and the type of wood, but typically that's about what it is. There's also different kinds of preservatives you can use, which are waterborne and oil-borne. Oil-borne can be toxic and discolor wood, but it does saturate better. As we see when we spill oil on our clothes, it saturates better. It's harder to get out. Whereas waterborne is usually odorless, easier to use, but maybe it doesn't soak in as well, which isn't the best. So, it's all based on your preference and the kind of money you have on which one you can use. But preservatives are good because it preserves the deck, prevents it from weathering as quickly, and makes it last longer, which is nice. Lastly, something we learned as well when designing a deck is to figure out what connection from the beam to the post you're going to have. And so if you remember, the beams hold up the joists, and then the beams are held up by the posts. And there's several ways you can hold the beams to the post. You could do beam on post or beam over post, which is just the beam is on top of the post, and then you screw them in with post caps. And that's probably the strongest because the most strength in the post comes from that top down. So you're not screwing it on the side, it's resting on the post. It's the strongest there, which is the most preferred. But it also depends on the design and the aesthetics of the deck and how you want it to look. Also, depending on how you do it is how high the deck will be. So you have notched where the top of the post is cut out a little bit, and then the beam sits in the middle in it, and then there's a bolt that goes through all the way through to both ends. That's strong as well because it's still sitting on top of the post. A reason for doing this is to kind of hide the post or hide the beam within the post, lower the deck a little bit. So there's a number of reasons to do it. Lastly, there's separated beam, which isn't the strongest. It still holds up, but compared to the other ones, it's not as strong. And that is, that's where the beam is screwed into the side of the post, usually bolted in, and there's different clamps. There's different hangers, ties, and straps you can use to hold the beam to the post. And why that's not the strongest, because that takes the stress away from the top of the post and puts it on the side where the tie or the clamp or the strap is, and in those bolts. So it's not the strongest, but it still works. It's still good, and that's another way to kind of hide the top of the post and make it elevated with the beam. So there's a number of things you can do when designing for that beam to post connection, which is nice. For designing, we also looked kind of like with the pond and water feature design, there's kind of like this manual that are used for deck design that has pre-calculated numbers on, well, if you have this much live or dead load, this is what size wood you should use, this is how far it can span, the spacing of the joists, things like that. So we're able to use that as we kind of got into deck design, and like the other designs we've done this semester, we kind of did some practice together and then in groups, and then our final is going to be our own deck design, which I'll get into next week. We also took a class photo for Melosi. If you remember, a couple weeks ago we met with them virtually and talked with them, and so they sent us some goodie bags with some water bottles and scales and things like that. So took a picture, and that's kind of our class, as you can see, which is nice. It's a small class, but it was fun nonetheless. Other than that, that's about it. We covered a lot, and we're getting into more of it next week, but it should be fun, and it should be a good end to the semester. So thanks for watching.